This is a really special crypto party. I mean, it's not often that you have a space like this, such a fantastic space, dedicate itself to a season all about privacy. And that's what the whole season is about. There are more events, as I said, so do pick up one of these. For us, this is like, you know, a dream come true, to be part of a whole season of events about the right to privacy. And as Big Brother Watch, as an NGO, that's really a large part of the focus of our work. We are a civil liberties organisation, but we do focus on technology and human rights. And we find that two of the rights that are most at stake are probably the right to privacy and freedom of expression as well. This is extremely pertinent and important time for us to be having these discussions. In case anyone here did miss the beginning, CryptoParty is a decentralised movement to deliver free, beginner-friendly digital privacy workshops all around the world. Big Brother Watch, in collaboration with Fabio from Reckon Digital, organise monthly crypto parties in London. So if you didn't get enough tonight, you can come next time. We've got another one booked for the 18th of December, so you can ask us about that. And we always have free workshops offering, we give training in free and open source software, and we have topical lightning talks and sometimes special panels like what we have this evening. So as CryptoParty and as Big Brother Watch, we're working clearly to protect privacy now, but also with a future lens as well. We want to protect privacy for tomorrow. We recognise that privacy is a fundamental and vital human right that's critical in the balance of power between the citizen and the state. But perhaps uniquely, it's a fundamental human right that's already been renegotiated in this technological revolution. I do think the meaning of privacy is changing, its relevance is being questioned, and its future is quite uncertain. In the years since 9/11, quite a lot of rights have been bargained, and you'll remember there were a few hairy years where there were lots of strange counter-terror measures going on, but the measures that have affected privacy have been quite lasting. In the age of insecurity, the state operates almost on in a mode of constant paranoia, and has now claimed the ability to access and analyse all of our communications all of the time. And I'm not really making an overstatement. A couple of years ago, a new law called the Investigatory Powers Act was passed, which, and we'll say it time and time again, is the most totalitarian surveillance law of any democracy in history. So the state now has the ability to collect all of our communications, intercept en masse, even hack devices en masse. So we have to ask, in this new sort of age of insecurity, in this new age of anxiety, has privacy become a kind of thoughtless trade-off? Is it something that we've become really accustomed to trading for a sense of security? And if people care less about their privacy in relation to the state, how do they feel about their privacy in relation to companies? How do they feel about their privacy when they feel like they're getting something in return for trading it? Smart technologies are now pretty much ubiquitous. Internet-connected devices, most of us are always on, always online. And this is allowing ordinary people in the West to enjoy a kind of luxury executive lifestyle. We've got diaries that self-organise, we've got photo albums that sort themselves. At the click of a button, we can have a taxi and someone to pick up our laundry. It's a completely new way of living, really. But as this technology hurtles forward, and I think is stress testing some areas of human rights law, data protection law is also striving to keep up. And this year we've had the introduction of the GDPR. Does everyone know what GDPR is? General Data Protection Regulation. And, well, I know what you definitely will have experienced, an endless torrent of emails asking you to confirm your subscription to 1,000,001 people you never knew you had a subscription with. And so maybe this new regulation demonstrates that actually as a society, we do now have a really keen awareness and consciousness of privacy. and of the importance of data protection, even if it's kind of translated through those really irritating emails. But the biggest questions, I think, are just emerging on the horizon, which is why I'm so glad that we've got the experts that we have on the panel this evening to talk about some of those kind of new questions. In a future of big data and artificial intelligence, I think it will be irresistibly tempting for authorities and companies to quantify citizens, to quantify entire societies with the goal of making better decisions, making society better. And the question is, at what cost? And will it always be in our interests as well? So we've got a fantastic panel to discuss these issues. We have Glyn Moody, technology writer and author of books including Rebel Code and Digital Code of Life. We have Vinous Ali, the head of policy at TechUK, and previously a political advisor on home affairs. And Alejandro Saucedo, chairman of the Institute for Ethical AI and Machine Learning. So we've got a really broad spectrum of knowledge and expertise. I'm going to ask the panel to each spend about 5 minutes setting out their basic response, their views, their hopes, fears about the future of privacy. And then we'll have a brief discussion. We'll open up to the audience. I think for once, we probably will try to avoid questions. You can ask questions if you like, but we'll invite comments, if that's okay, so it can be more of a discussion rather than a Q&A. So, can we start with Glyn? What does the future of privacy look like?
Okay, good evening, everyone. So the good news is we know exactly what the future of privacy will look like in 10 years' time. The bad news is it looks like China. So I just want to talk a little bit about China as an indication of what could happen and maybe what we don't want to happen. So I'm sure lots of you know recently has been in the news about Xinjiang with the stories of up to 1 million Uyghurs held in various kind of camps. Outside those camps, there is an incredible surveillance system that really is beyond anything we've ever seen before. Not only have you got the CCTV cameras on every street corner, you have all biometrics taken. So that's irises, fingerprints, voice prints, and DNA of every Uyghur in Xinjiang. So that's a complete database of those people. And one hopes that that is some way off for the West. But if you look at what's happening in the rest of China, I think you'll see things that are more familiar, because outside Xinjiang, there is also a total surveillance system, but it's much more subtle because it's based around technology, digital technology. There are 3 main computer companies, internet companies in China. There's Baidu, which is a search engine. There's Alibaba, which is an e-commerce site. And there's Tencent. And Tencent is in many ways most interesting because it's a $500 billion company, which probably most people have never heard of. So it's a huge company. I think it's the 5th biggest company in the world by share valuation. And it has a product called WeChat. And WeChat is used by 1 billion people. And WeChat is, as the name suggests, it started out as a chat program, but it is now a platform. So you run programs on WeChat. There are now 1 million what are called mini programs running on WeChat. You can do anything with WeChat. You can book taxis, you can book meals, you can pay for anything. It's absolutely fantastic. It makes the West technology look really pathetic. But the reason those 3 big companies in China are so successful is because the Chinese government has let them get that successful. And in return, the Chinese government has access to everything on those platforms. So every time you book a taxi, every time you buy a meal, the Chinese government can know if it wants to. So that is total surveillance through the smartphone, because most people in China use smartphones, not any other kind of device. Now, if you look at what's happening in the West, it's actually pretty similar. You know, everyone here, I'm sure, has got a smartphone. Most people are using Google, which is like Baidu. Most people are using Amazon, which is like Alibaba. Most people, well, probably used to use Facebook. I imagine you've all moved off it by now because you're sort of leading people. But anyway, you belong to social networks. And those social networks are tracking you. And in fact, we've seen recently the abuse that can lead to, particularly through Cambridge Analytica, but particularly micro-targeting of ads allows groups of 2 or 3 people to be targeted with advertising. And that micro-targeting is based on them knowing everything about you. So the situation from China isn't that different. In fact, the governments, UK, US governments, probably have access to most of that information. Edward Snowden indicated that was the case. It's not quite so formalized as in China, but it's nonetheless very close. So perhaps we can talk about later in this session is how we can stop going full China, in other words, really losing control. But the main problem really is that technology is just too good. It's too much fun to use and we're all addicted to it. And I think that's the biggest problem in terms of preserving privacy is fighting that urge just to have fun on the technology and not worry about the consequences.
Great, thank you. Venus, could you talk a little bit about the future of privacy through your lens? I mean, often we're talking about state surveillance, but it's intractably linked with companies as well and facilitated by the companies.
No, 100%. So actually, I'm going to dispute the point that you made earlier about Facebook and how you've probably all moved off that platform.
I was trying to flatter them.
Yeah. Can I ask how many of you still have a Facebook account? So that's probably...
How many use it actively?
But they still have it. And that's a really interesting point. I think, you touched on this issue in your sort of opening remarks, Silkie, and you sort of really brought it out, is when we talk about technology, what we're really talking about, and the issues around privacy, we're sort of saying privacy v convenience. It's become incredibly convenient for us to have everything at our fingertips. As the sort of Internet of Things develops, what you see is everything becoming so much more convenient. It's really convenient if I can sort of send a signal from my smartphone to my kettle to make me a cup of coffee first thing in the morning. It's incredibly convenient if on my way home I can say, oh, it's a bit chilly tonight, I'm going to turn the thermostat on and set the temperature remotely so that when I get into my house, it's already warm for me. These things are incredibly convenient to our lives. And frankly, the more data that we share, the better services we get. And that's the real problem. So when we're talking about privacy, it's always this sort of balancing act between, do we want privacy or do we want convenience? I think, you can't say it better than if a service is free, then the payment is you and your data that you're giving up. And I think, what's really interesting is that after Cambridge Analytica, you saw the hashtags delete Facebook, which is ironic in itself because you're using another social media platform to broadcast that message and to make those links and to have those conversations. But it didn't really translate into people deleting their accounts because for most people it is still a great way to organise an event. It's a great way to keep in contact with family, and it's a great way to share photos of moments that mean something to you. So I think, we've still got a long way to go. And so I think as we look forward and into the next 10 years and what we mean when we're talking about privacy, I think it's really understanding. It's, how do we build public understanding about what it is we're giving up and why we're giving it up and what are we getting in return? Because really it's about, the choice you have and whether you're making an informed choice. And then when you look into the future, and you mentioned artificial intelligence, for example, it's not an area that I know too much about. I'm sure you'll correct me when I'm wrong, but it's very real that soon the intelligence will become so sophisticated that we won't know how decisions are made. We won't know how decisions have been reached that will impact our lives, whether that's in insurance or health or these really sort of sensitive fields. And there's a question of, well, what's the ethics around that? Do we really want someone to be able to, explain how a decision was made? Can we appeal a decision? Can we find out how we can, where's the human in the loop in that sort of sense? So I think that's where the conversation has to go. It's about creating a public dialogue on these sort of issues as the technology develops. At the moment, I think what we're seeing is technology running away with itself, and for a scandal having to happen, for there to be a moment of reckoning, a moment where there is public awareness, where there is a call to action, call to arms, but then a retrenchment of the same norms, the same practices, etc., with just tweaks at the margin, because frankly, people have said, it's still convenient, so we're still going to get on with and do things just as we've been doing for the last 5 years, 10 years, etc. And I think, you know, for that to happen, you really need to have proper public education, public awareness about what does this technology mean, how is our data used, how is it stored, who is it given to, how can I access it, can I move between different platforms and take my data with me, what is the legacy of the data that I leave behind, coming back to the issue of if you're active on Facebook or not, really doesn't matter. I was reading the other day, you know, MySpace still holds a lot of data on us. I don't know how many of you could even, you know, tell me what your MySpace user profile was today. So I think, you know, that's a really, really interesting thing, because I think in the future, not talking from a state perspective, but from a company perspective, there are going to be enormous amounts of innovation and some really fantastic things happening. But it should be down to the choice of citizens and of the public to say, do I want to engage with this? Do I understand what it means when I engage with this? And what's the payoff? And I think that's where we're just not there yet. And we've got quite a long way to go to actually raise the public awareness. And I think, you know, Big Brother Watch does an excellent job of doing that. But it's about reaching those sort of hard to reach areas and make sure that everyone's got sort of a sustained level of understanding and awareness, rather than these sort of peaks of outrage that you get after a scandal that then die down and everyone gets on with business as normal. And so, you know, only when you can reach that sort of sustained level of understanding and be able to have that public dialogue on issues like ethics, can you actually really start to have a conversation about where we as a society want to draw the line to make sure that we don't turn into the new China.
Great, thank you. Alejandro, you're someone who thinks a lot about the future and future technologies. How do you see the future of privacy?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm really excited to discuss some of those points. I wrote some stuff down, which was things that I had in my mind. I think it's interesting to see in the future, which is 10 years, is probably not as long. HS2 is going to be halfway by then. And you know, from that perspective, if we look at different areas where privacy has been challenged, you know, the introduction of I don't know, phones into households, or I don't know, the e-commerce sort of introduction and the questions of how that's going to affect you know, the online presence, people hiring chief privacy officers, then the big data craze with the Hadoop sort of introduction, and the challenges that raised, and then to today, which is basically with machine learning and the technology that allows us to identify patterns from data that would otherwise not be possible just by having humans. Even though there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of variables in terms of what privacy and what a reasonable amount of privacy meant, that today may be different to yesterday. There are some constants, there's some patterns, and these patterns, you know, involve this perspective of you know, what is the structures that are currently in place in society so that people cannot exploit the data that is collected, as well as what are the innovations that are really circumventing these structures so that people can actually exploit that. These innovations can be technical or non-technical, could be legal. For an example would be this, you know, from an adversarial network, adversarial approach that for example, cryptography has. There's people trying to create algorithms, and there's people that are trying to break them. And often you have people that are able to circumvent them by just having a man-in-the-middle attack that, you know, all the data that goes through their server may just not be encrypted at all. So they don't even need to deal with that technology. So I think, you know, from that perspective, when we start looking at the future, I think is that question of what are going to be those variables that are going to be changing. What is going to be the structure and the perception of data? What is the data that is going to be collected? And what are going to be these potential loopholes? What are the innovations that are going to come that are going to potentially disrupt? And something that I'm seeing right now is that in the field of machine learning, these questions about explainability, bias, algorithmic bias, reproducibility, all of these questions that arise from the ethical perspective, they often appear because is this new role that has appeared. This intersection between data scientists, software engineers, and industry domain experts. And basically, it is software engineers that are doing statistics in production when they're just not really carrying best practices, or statisticians that are building production-ready systems. And I do see in the next few years, we're going to start building frameworks that allow to regulate this. I think from the point of GDPR, I think the only way to really be able to start regulating privacy is separating the computation from the data ownership, and be able to give consent from the perspective of what are you going to do with my data as opposed to you getting access to it. And I do feel that in the next 10 years we're going to see a lot of standards, less in the regulation side, more in the industry self-regulatory side, to set structures in place to be able to avoid this. Now, to the point that you mentioned in China, I do think in the next 10 years we're also going to see the global battle towards scrambling on this AI winner, and that may incur a lot of cost and quality when it comes to developing the systems well, just by wanting to win. So I do fear a lot of these potential damages that may appear, especially as a lot of the stuff that we've seen is only in B2C. We are yet to see stuff in B2B, and I'm actually quite nervous to see when AI goes into the railways, into construction, into all of these areas. So I think that is some of the thoughts that came from what was mentioned.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to kick off with the first question, if you don't mind. How do we not go full China? You said that it's clearly like a blueprint for how the future could look in a kind of tech dystopia, if we're honest. What is it that will prevent our society, given the current direction of travel, from going the same way?
I think there are two sort of vague, hopeful aspects. One is the GDPR, which we've already mentioned, and it is worth emphasizing how amazing it is that we have this legislation protecting privacy. It's really unprecedented. And you've already seen the impact it's had on American companies, either because they've locked you out of their sites or because they've started to adopt European-style privacy protection. And the fact that the European Union has been able to do that is massively important, because it holds out the hope that that might actually spread further. And indeed, there is another piece of legislation called the e-privacy regulation, which builds on the GDPR, which hasn't been passed yet, but which would strengthen it even more. Unfortunately, the lobbyists are really trying to kill it at the moment. So if you could write a letter to your MEP, ask them to support it, that would be really handy. So there's some hope, I think, in terms of the strength of the legislation which is being put through and will maybe go through in the EU. And the other side of things is open source software, because that represents a radically different way of writing software that addresses a lot of the issues of privacy that we're seeing. And I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about it in some of the other sessions. But the technical solutions are there. It's really the social issues that are hard, particularly network effects. We can create open source versions of Facebook and Google, but people won't use them because no one else is using them. So the question is, how do we move from this situation we have at the moment to one that would be better? And that's difficult.
I just will contest briefly. From a human rights perspective, we have inscribed. The regulation is all right. I'm not as optimistic as you know about it as you. GDPR's a step in the right direction, but we've had the human right to privacy inscribed in law since the end of World War II as a vital, fundamental human right, and yet in 2018 we're living in an environment of mass surveillance in the world's leading democracy. You lived through some of that policy hell with me. How do we square that circle?
I think it, like I said before in sort of the remarks to open, it's about education. We live in a democracy and we can kick MPs out if they fail to, act on our behalf. But in order to be able to do that, you need to understand what it is you're fighting for and why it's important, and actually help MPs who are just ordinary folk who've been elected understand the issues at stake, so that they don't fall entrapped sort of lobbyists, as you said. And you need to arm them with the tools, the knowledge to understand those issues, and at the moment that's not there. And if there's not this, you know, the Investigatory Powers Act actually went through without a big fight on, you know, not from the government's backbenches, not from the main opposition party, because the rhetoric and the environment that we've, you know, that the government's very handily sort of positioned us in is one of insecurity and constant paranoia. So it's about changing the conversation, and you can only change the conversation if you've built that understanding. I think without that, then, you know, we could easily sleepwalk into a China, and I don't think actually we're that far from it if we're very honest with ourselves to actually look at, you know, what the legislation allows and it enables, you know, for governments to do in terms of sort of mass surveillance, etc.
And Alejandro, some of the new technologies that you're working on, they're data-driven. So if you're a pessimist like me, it looks like things might only get worse in terms of privacy. Is there anything unique to new technologies like new uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning that you think are inherently risky for the future of privacy, or do you think are you optimistic about their ability to protect citizens' rights?
Wow, that's a hard question. I think I do want to and I think to address this question of whether there are technologies that will help on that privacy side. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, there are a lot of things that are currently being developed, such as differential privacy, anti-statistical noise to queries, so that people that run analysis on data are able to not get access to that personal data, for example. But I think the challenge here is, I would say, more towards the education, but also I would want to touch upon that point on open source, because I think that is incredibly important. This ability to make sure that regulation is gonna come. I think in 10 years, probably it's gonna be only a few iterations, and the immediate things that really will be coming will be self-industry regulating standards. Things that drive suppliers and innovative companies to make sure they set the bar for quality, for safety, for efficiency, mainly because it's good for business. And I think the UK is really, really good for that. It's lost its way in some of the industries like railways when they forgot why safety was introduced for the first place, which was actually to make the industry more efficient. So in terms of technologies that are out there, I think they're available, but it's about making sure that the processes are instilled and really are enforced. People are empowered and you know, they're obligated to develop these technologies in a responsible sense, making sure that we take best practices and think how to implement them in just these new roles. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have any comments from the audience? Mr. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical of the idea. I'm very skeptical of the idea that regulation is the solution to this, because like you're asking for the same government that pushed the data protection, the Investigatory Powers Bill to regulate to protect our privacy. Sure, they might pass a few laws to require companies to ask for consent. That's already the case with GDPR. But effectively, their main interest is to protect our privacy as long as they have access to our data. And the interest of companies is to protect our privacy as long as the companies have access to our data. Like Gmail is very secure, but it's not. But they're only secure because they want to be the only people to have access to your data. So I think this is not. I think it's not this. I mean, sure, we could have, even if we do have more regulation, might have like things like we have the GDPR, for example. Which explicitly requires companies to ask for your consent to have, you know, a lot of kind of like options for consumers and a lot of safeguards. But effectively, consumers still use these products and they still have their data being collected for advertising and stuff like that. That's not because they're not following the regulation or the regulation is not good. Because the fundamental problem is that customers, they use Facebook because of the network effect, and also because they don't want to pay for a service. And the main business model of Facebook is they make money through targeted advertising. So maybe I'm being pessimistic here, but I've kind of given up on the idea that regulation could really do much here. And as I think to Glyn's point, there are technologies that can be used to kind of create alternatives. So I don't think the kind of trade-off between privacy and convenience is inherent. Like there are technologies out there. There's a whole kind of research community, the computer sciences, that allow you to kind of create technologies like privacy-enhancing technologies, zero-knowledge proofs, homomorphic encryption, and so forth, that allow you to build alternatives to these platforms that are inherently privacy-preserving. But of course, the problem is how do you fund them? So I think the fundamental, if you want to tackle this problem at its core, you need to think of models to create business models for these organizations that don't incentivize them to do targeted advertising and collect people's data.
That's a challenge, isn't it? That the market doesn't really, a free market doesn't bend towards the rights of people. Any other comments? Yeah.
Yeah. I have to disagree with the person who was just talking. I think regulation is absolutely necessary because now we're moving to an age of the Internet of Things. I mean, the lady there said, oh, I can set my kettle to boil before I go home. But that means there's got to be a computer chip in that kettle. But what about the security? You know, can have driverless cars, you know, all sorts of devices in the home, like from the fridge, telling you that you're running out of milk or something like that. But the problem is, nobody wants to pay for the security for it. I mean, you have to like download a patch for your fridge every month. So regulation is the only way to make the companies who sell these things take things seriously. Because otherwise they'll just go, I want to make a big bucks as fast as possible, and they won't really care about security. They'll just do what's the most convenient and the cheapest.
Do you trust government and policymakers to bring forward a kind of regulation that will safeguard privacy and security for the future?
Well, I don't really like it, but that's the only party in town as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the regulations that have come into Europe are very good. But you have to make manufacturers of products responsible for the products they actually give to people, make sure they're safe, they're secure. But if government doesn't do that, then I think private companies will give a hoot. If anything happens, like someone hacks someone's kettle in their house or starts a fire, they need to be forced to take responsibility for their products.
Okay. By the way, if the panellists have any responses or other members of the audience have any responses, wave at me. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can I respond to that point specifically? I think, you know, when we're talking about industry not really caring, I think that's a mischaracterization for the big players and the good actors out there for a large part. And I think, you know, the problem is when you get to the stage of where you're just bolting on these things, you're bolting security on at the end, you're bolting on ethics at the end. What we really need to start doing, and I think, you know, a lot of people in industry are having these conversations now, is how do you do this by design? How do you, you know, safety by design, security by design? These are all really important issues that I think, you know, good actors in the space want to make sure that they get right from the very beginning. So I take your point, you know, I think regulation has a very important role to play, particularly, you know, smart regulation. Good regulation actually can breed better innovation. But I think, you know, that has to go hand in hand with what industry is already doing. in terms of making sure that, you know, best practice doesn't stay within one company but filters through and is shared, but also making sure that it's done from the get-go, from the design point, rather than seen as like a bolt-on at the end. Because I think that's where you get to the point where they go, okay, well, it's an extra expense, rather than sort of thinking about it from the very start of the process.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that. I was involved with No to ID, and that was an interesting concept because I was trying to market the idea to kind of galvanise people to take this seriously. And you had a very powerful tool there. It's like, stop, show us your papers. Because
does anyone not know what the No to ID campaign was? Okay, it was the campaign from, 2005 against the introduction of national identity cards.
Identity cards.
In the UK.
So you had that kind of very powerful image of, stop, have you got your papers? So you could galvanise people to take this seriously. Now, when your devices can be interrogated without you being aware of them, the need for an ID card, you're all carrying ID cards. So to get people to take privacy seriously, I think the only tool that you can use is not, you know, regulation from a government perspective. It's democratising the ownership of your data so that you realise the value to your data. So you feel as if you're being robbed in a way of something valuable that's got a cash value. So if you moved people to owning their own data and owning the value that goes with it, you could maybe get people to take the issue more seriously.
Okay, yes.
Following on from that point about motivations, reasons, I've lived in China for some time, and one conversation I had with, I think it was probably about 12-year-old young person, who, when I asked about, so what about your privacy in the context of this sort of social media, very convenient world, said, I've never had any, as a response, and I thought that was really, really dark sentence. As that raises the question around what is the norm, what is your expectation? If you never thought you had privacy in the first place, you don't think you've lost it. And secondly, what choices do you think you have? And are those choices just within a market-led model? And now I can sell my data or not sell it. Are those choices actually, do I need to give it to anyone at all? What are the options? And I totally agree with, I think a few people have said, trying at a grassroots level to make that a more of an open discussion, perhaps even for younger people as well.
Other comments?
Hi. So I think there are a couple of differences that we need to make. First, there's one thing to have good regulation and a totally different thing to have a good implementation of that regulation, which is not the case for GDPR in my point of view. And just to give you a very simple, stupid example, let's talk about the cookie banners. So you have this annoying banners dominating the web nowadays, and even if you are conscious about your privacy and you want to actually customize your privacy preferences, you get another banner telling you that you need to enable third-party cookies in order to be able to get rid of the advertisers that are tracking you. So unfortunately, I don't think we have enough tools to fight all these problems, and I think there's a very big lack of understanding from the side of the users on how exactly companies are using our data. And I'm pretty sure even in the mobile app environment, lots of apps are sending data to Facebook without the user consenting to it and without its knowledge. So better tools definitely need to be created. A better implementation is highly urgent. And I would also argue that there's one thing to have open source software, but it's a totally different thing to have decentralized open source software. And my preference would be for the latter. And I think, yeah, a combination of both good implementation with a good regulation with good implementation and effective one, and decentralized open source software might lead us to a not so gloomy privacy future.
Does anyone not know what open source software is? Can you just briefly explain?
Code that is being built collaboratively by different developers and with a source code that is open to everybody to analyze and to fix and to report and to contribute to.
Thank you.
I wanted to add on to what has been said, to all the different potential way forward we can move with open source, with different perceptions of what is normal, or just ownership of data. I wonder if we need to even go further and not look at technology as something Venus said, getting ahead of us, and something that we need to regulate, but look at technology, something as what we construct as a society, and that we are empowered. It's only what we make of it. And we are right now at the crossroads of a time where we can actually, as a society, define the norms and what it should be, what predictive algorithms or this automated decision-making algorithms should be. And I wonder if that's the way forward, actually.
But how do we do that? If you've got like a company like Google that has a kind of architecture and algorithms that we can't see, we can't change, we don't know how it works, that most of us have services through that company. You sound very optimistic about our opportunities to kind of engage with it, and I expect that you're right. But how does that match up with some of the really big players in the space? Do you think it's more about open source development, or?
I definitely. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I definitely think there are different avenues to encourage this. I think the civil society has a really important role in terms of communicating, educating, and being proactive about it. But I do think the government also has a role as not necessarily regulators, but catalysts in their own procurement of these technologies to set the norms as a different push factor. So I think it really has to be a collective effort from all the different stakeholders, and it's not really only looking at centralizing big players from the Silicon Valley, or only looking at governments, or looking at individuals and their private choices. Yeah. But, I mean...
Great, okay.
I think it was the New Statesman last week. There was an article on leaving Facebook, and I was encouraged. I think it was where it was. Anyway, I recall an article anyway, and I left Facebook after 9-10 years, or how long it's been, and I'm interested in knowing what as the article described, ways people are finding to satisfy their need to communicate. As human beings, we want to communicate. It's our instinct to do so. And even though Instagram is owned by Facebook, perhaps that's a nicer and more friendly, less poisonous, toxic sort of environment that Facebook seems to be with discussions and things like that, where we are able to communicate with our friends and family in a visual way, and that is no bad thing. And I'm interested in thinking of other platforms that we could use, and I'm certain that the younger people in the room find that Facebook is less kind of cool. It's usually the old people on their essay who like Facebook to surveil their children and so on. Anyway, just a thought, and I'd be interested to think about and ask people to think about what alternatives there might be.
Interesting. Just if you can pass the mic back.
Yeah, hi. I wonder whether there's a dimension of practitioner ethics as well. For those who are involved with data science, the governor of Maryland problem is a thing. The governor of Maryland was revealed as suffering from cancer. And the reason he was revealed as suffering from cancer was because his diary was published and he had a kind of closed private sessions. And also the treatment records of Bethesda General Hospital were also published but anonymized, and somebody used data science software, data science, machine learning software to correlate the two, and revealed that the governor of Maryland was receiving treatment for cancer. But for me, the issue is not the technology around it. It was actually when you discover that new knowledge, it's unethical to reveal it. And I think one of the things we need to think about is, well, what kind of standards of ethics are we demanding from practitioners, especially as data science is becoming a profession with standards and qualifications and professional bodies? What kind of standards are we demanding of the practitioners to say, well, actually, you just created a piece of new knowledge that doesn't belong to you, and you can't just share it. So I'm looking across at Alejandro, but yeah, that was the thought that was on my mind.
I think I'd love to answer that. So I guess that's a very good question. I mean, when faced into this new technology, you're able to analyze data sets which before were fine, but with new advancements, you are able to identify things that, if disclosed or if used to our own benefit or to the company's benefit, it would be unethical. And I was actually having a chat today with a professor on criminology and law, and it boils down against to first principles. It is that perspective that when it comes to psychology, if you are going to, for example, publish a report, publish a paper that involves humans for whatever experiment you're running, it needs to go through an ethics board of approval. You need to have a training on that specific ethical perspective with case studies. And it's interesting because now we see software developers and data scientists that used to just do this role that was about just development. Now that they're finding in this intersection of this machine learning engineering role, which involves not only the statistician knowledge and the software knowledge, but also that domain expertise knowledge, when performing these tasks, there needs to be those sort of processes around it so that they're able to be delivered in the right way. An example is Facebook. When they perform their A/B testing across hundreds of thousands of users a day and release reports, this is not something that may be on that goes through an ethics board. I mean, that's probably something that they may release on a blog post, and it may be people that mean best. So that's actually one of the things that we're focusing on. We basically released a set of principles that try to tackle the high-level practitioner best practices to follow when performing the delivery of one of these machine learning solutions. But I would say it boils down not on how to introduce ethics to the algorithm, it boils down how to make sure that the ethical decisions are done by the people around the algorithm. And if you look at ACM's Code of Ethics that was released in like 1990 something, they just updated it and it's still relevant. I think if people guide themselves to that, now it's a question of what has been asked, how do we make sure that it's beyond regulation, that it actually happens? But really good question. Very interesting.
Okay, there's just one more comment at the back. Okay, yeah, very quickly, and then we're going to wrap up.
An interesting time is that there are alternatives to Google and Hotmail and Gmail and that sort of thing. But you need to go into the internet and find them. For example, there's Google, but there's also a very good site called DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine which doesn't track you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pro DuckDuckGo. If you can pass the mic up to the back, please.
Thank you. So the first comment to make, and please don't take this the wrong way, but I'm a little surprised to come to an event called CryptoParty London and no one's mentioned cryptography really in a big way. Aren't there sort of dozens or even hundreds of small businesses trying to solve exactly this problem, and key here, in a way that doesn't require trust? I mean, hands up here, who trusts the government to regulate well? And even if you do, they're not going to do it, in real time. They're going to be 10 years behind the time. It's even the best legislator in the world cannot legislate in real time. And then, if it takes 5 years, which is quick in the House of Parliament, it's too late. Your data's already out there. The second thing, with the China analogy, I think we all here agree we don't want to go as far as they've gone, but there's a key difference there. Here, the main problem, I think, or one of the main problems, is we're giving away our data for convenience. We are consenting, but is it informed consent? I don't think it is, and some of the panelists have mentioned this. You know, if the regulation was you must have a quick summary pop-up box when you join or purchase on Amazon or consent to something with Gmail or Facebook, how many people compared to now would be giving all this data away? I think they'd think twice. And anybody is capable of processing that information. Very few people really know the cutting edge of machine learning or data science. And I think the final point, if it hasn't slipped my mind, so someone mentioned Proton Mail. I mean, that's a good example. The market can deliver, and there is a demand for privacy solutions. It's just, people like us here, we don't necessarily know enough about what works, what's out there, is it good or not? That's why we're coming to these events. So I wouldn't be totally pessimistic. There are solutions out there, but I don't think relying on one sector that each person might have their own bias. Are they pro or anti-business, pro or anti-regulation? I think a combination. You've always got to rely on yourself and sort of community action. You can trust yourself to do what is in your interests and to make an effort towards that, but you need help. You need to connect with people who are going to inform you, as we've been doing today. So that's my little 5 cents or 5 pence.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, what an interesting array of comments and views. Everyone's less pessimistic and less apocalyptic than me, which is great. That's a relief. But by the way, we had a workshop on end-to-end encryption and crypto communications. It's interesting though. It's a good point that we haven't really positioned cryptography as being really key in defending the future of privacy. Although I do think it's a view that maybe we have as CryptoParty, because that's what we do every month, train people.
But also it should be built into the plumbing. People shouldn't have to worry about it. So that's a technical problem that the technical people should solve, because expecting people to I use PGP, but I doubt whether many people do use PGP because it's quite hard. But that shouldn't be the case. So you're right, it's crucial, but equally it isn't for people really to solve that problem.
Yeah. Can I ask the panelists then, if you can, in 1 or 2 sentences, can you sum up, really sum up, just in a sentence, the future of privacy, but also maybe what you think needs to happen or what action people need to take? Glyn?
I mean, I agree absolutely with the last gentleman. I think what we have to do is all of the above, and that's really been very clear. Everyone had good suggestions, but it's not just one of those. We really need all of those things. So we need, regulation. We need to know about the technical tools. We need open source. Everything. So it's got to be the complete solution, because one of them on their own is not enough.
Great, thanks, Venus.
Yeah, so I think industry are doing a lot here, but I think you can quite easily find yourself in a situation where you're just walking into a future where privacy is just not talked about, etc. And I think it comes back down to sort of how do you educate not just people who, in order to learn about this, you've had to have some sort of interest and inkling to have brought you here today. And it's how do you get out and reach wider audiences? Is this not something that should be taught in schools as sort of, basic, along with maths, literacy, etc.? So I think we need to get there if we're going to have proper conversations about these subjects en masse and have a proper public dialogue on this.
Great. Alejandro.
Awesome. I think I would say that probably it's not as grim as many people may think, but that is because of people like yourselves are going to be driving the change. I do feel the UK is in a prime position to set at least some global standards and lead the way in some areas. And the way that I would push towards that is by empowering people that want to do good and regulating or putting standards for the people that don't.
Great, well, thank you so much. Should we thank the panellists? Really interesting discussion. If you're interested in these issues and you want to be part of the discussion, you want to be part of the solutions as well, please follow the work and support the work of Big Brother Watch, because this is what we are doing day in and day out. Don't go anywhere, because we've got cocktails and music coming imminently. I mean, the cocktails, you have to go and get them, but they're crypto themed. I'm drinking, sipping, a triple security. You can't miss out. You have to go and try it. There's more in this fantastic series at Free Word. Next week, there's a discussion with Gus Hussain, who's the director of Privacy International, on how dystopian fiction like Black Mirror, A Clockwork Orange, and more compare with present reality. That sounds amazing. So have a look at it. And as I said, the programs are everywhere. So yeah, I want to finally thank the panelists and Fabio for co-organising CryptoParty, and Zane and Free Word for having us. If you liked it and you'd like to come to another CryptoParty and learn more, we've got our Cryptmas party. It's on the 18th of December, and yeah, we could. I mean, the mince spies. So yeah, 18th of December at Juju's bar in Shoreditch. But yeah, go and get a cocktail, and thank you for coming.